The 1943 New Zealand general election was held on the 23rd and 24th of September 1943 to elect a total of 80 MPs to the 27th session of the New Zealand Parliament. Wait, what? Another late election? And where's Mickey Savage or Adam Hamilton for that matter? Looks like we're in another world war again. So strap yourselves in for possibly New Zealand's messiest ever election. In 1938, Michael Joseph Savage and his Labour government were riding high. They had just won back-to-back elections and had the highest approval ratings for any government in the country's history. In just a few short years, they had radically transformed New Zealand society, with huge restructuring of the social security, health, education and public works system. To many Kiwis, it was as if the sun was shining again and the gloom of the Depression was finally being lifted. However, it was not to be, as by the end of the following year, New Zealand would be at war once again. Despite being oceans away, Kiwis paid a keen interest to the goings-on in Europe. Germany was now a major power again, seemingly rebuilt and re-energised by its Führer Adolf Hitler and its ruling Nazi government. Now Germany was out for revenge and territory as Hitler began building his 1,000-year Reich. In a futile attempt to contain Hitler, in 1938 British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain got Hitler to sign a peace agreement, known as the Munich Agreement, which guaranteed Hitler would not take Poland. However, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler would invade Poland. On September the 3rd, Britain and her empire would declare war on Germany, and thus the Second World War began. A few days later, New Zealand Prime Minister Mickey Savage would famously give a stirring speech on the radio declaring New Zealand's steadfast support of Britain and rallying the country to war.
I am satisfied that nowhere will the issue be more clearly understood than in New Zealand, where for almost a century, behind the sure shield of Britain, we have enjoyed and cherished freedom and self-government, both with gratitude for the past and with confidence in the future. We range ourselves without fear beside Britain. Where she goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand. We are only a small and young nation, but we are one and all a band of brothers, and we march forward with a union of hearts and wills to a common destiny.
Unknown to many Kiwis, however, was that speech was delivered from Savage's sickbed. It had been a tough year for Savage. Just before the 1938 election, Savage was diagnosed with colon cancer. However, he delayed treatment so that he could campaign in the election. Following the election, the Labour Party would be engulfed in the Lee affair, when Maverick MP for Grey Lynn, John A. Lee, the staunchly socialist one-armed war veteran, turned on his own party. In 1935, Lee was made an Undersecretary for Housing and helped establish the state housing program. This position was a surprise, as many had expected him to make cabinet. Following the 1938 election, with several openings in the cabinet, Lee was again not selected by Savage. Savage considered Lee too radical and uncontrolled, while Lee considered Savage too cautious. The two privately clashed on a number of issues. He became increasingly unhappy with the new government's economic policies, which he saw as overly cautious. Lee gradually emerged as the leader of Labour's left-wing faction, opposed primarily by the more orthodox Minister of Finance Walter Nash. Lee and his allies, as well as being strongly socialist, were influenced by social credit theory and believed that the government should take immediate control of the country's financial system. Nash opposed this and was able to block proposals put forward by Lee to nationalise the Bank of New Zealand. Gradually, Lee's criticism of the Labour Party leadership became increasingly public. Lee published the infamous Lee Letter, which outlined his criticisms of the party leadership. The Labour National Executive called Lee to appear before it and gave him warnings about the consequences to himself of such behaviour. However, Lee continued his attacks on the leadership more and more publicly. Later, Lee published an article bitterly accusing the cancer-stricken Savage of being mentally as well as physically ill. Kiwis were shocked that Lee would stoop to such lows of attacking his own Prime Minister, who was desperately sick. In early 1940, Lee was expelled from the Labour Party and he would go on to form and lead the Democratic Labour Party. However, the scandal had damaged the reputation of the Labour Party. At the same time, the Allied powers were on the back foot as the Nazi war machine steamrolled through Europe. At a time when Kiwis were in search of stability and reassurance, Prime Minister Mickey Savage would tragically pass away in March of 1940. Hundreds of thousands of mourners would line the streets to pay their respect, and Savage's body was transported from Wellington up to Auckland to be buried at Bastion Point overlooking the Waitemata Harbour. Mickey Savage is admired from many sides of the political spectrum and is known as the architect of the New Zealand welfare state. His government provided the foundations of the post-war consensus based upon an assumption that full employment would be maintained by Keynesian policies and that a greatly enlarged system of social services would be created. Savage is considered by academics and historians to be one of New Zealand's greatest and most revered prime ministers, often called everybody's uncle. His genial and charismatic personality and his skills as an orator were largely responsible for public acceptance of his government's radical policies. Exemplifying his enthusiasm for his government's policies, Savage personally assisted a family in Fife Lane, Miramar, Wellington to move their furniture into the first of the government's 1930 state houses. The unenviable task of leading a shocked and saddened nation through war would fall on the shoulders of Savage's deputy, Peter Fraser. Fraser was born in the Scottish Highlands in 1884. He would join the British Labour Party before immigrating to New Zealand in 1910, when he became a Wellington wharfie and unionist. Fraser would be a major player in the creation of the New Zealand Labour Party in 1916 and was elected to Parliament for Wellington Central in the 1918 by-election. Fraser became Minister of Health in 1935 and was a key architect of the Social Security Act in 1938. One of the biggest challenges Fraser faced almost immediately was a shortage of manpower and supplies. In June 1940, 60,000 men had volunteered to fight, but after that first flush of enthusiasm, recruitment had slowed. A steadier supply of men was needed to keep the fighting force in the field, and in July 1940 the choice of whether or not to sign up for war ceased to exist. The introduction of conscription meant that every man between 19 and 45 was liable for service. No one could escape the net as the government thralled for men. The matter of conscription was contentious. Many traditional followers of Labour were angry at the party stance. Many early Labour leaders, including Fraser, had been jailed for opposing conscription in World War I, and were branded hypocrites for later introducing it. Fraser justified his change of position by saying that World War I was a pointless war, but that World War II was necessary. As New Zealanders were fully engaged in the war effort, Fraser believed the situation was too dire for an election and thus used his huge majority to postpone the election from late 1941 to late 1943. That decision proved fortuitous, as in December of 1941, when the election would have been due, Japan entered the war on the Axis side when it attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, as well as British colonies of Malaya, Singapore and Hong Kong. With all this going on, I almost forgot to talk about the opposition. Well, poor old Hamdog was having a rough time. The National Party's defeat in 1938 weakened Adam Hamilton's position further, and many in the party were trying to oust him as leader. In 1940, Hamilton went to Fraser and proposed a wartime coalition government of Labour and National, just like the Reform Liberal coalition during World War I. However, Fraser flat out refused. Fraser would extend an olive branch and let Hamilton and Gordon Coates be members of the six-man war cabinet which oversaw the running of the war effort. Participation in the war cabinet was fatally damaging to Hamilton's leadership of the National Party, as many National MPs argued that he could not be a party leader whilst he served on a Labour-led council. On the 25th of November, a vote of 13 to 8 replaced Hamilton with Sidney Holland. In 1942, however, National withdrew from all cooperation with the Labour Party. Hamilton, along with Coates, protested the move and ceased attending National caucus meetings. Both Hamilton and Coates then rejoined the war administration despite condemnation from their party colleagues. Eventually, Hamilton managed to bring about rapprochement with the National Party, unlike Coates, who became an independent. Tragically, not long after, New Zealand would lose another of its political giants, when Gordon Coates would pass away at the age of 65 from a heart attack. Tributes would flow in across the country. Coates' style would live on through a young National MP whom Coates mentored, one Keith Holyoake. Just keep that name in mind, as you'll be hearing it a lot later. Sidney Holland, also known as Sid Holland, was born in Greendale in the Canterbury region of the South Island in 1893. He would serve as a lieutenant during the First World War, where he would be gravely injured and sent back home. In 1920, Holland would be married and start his own company which manufactured horticultural spray pumps. Holland's father was a prominent politician, and Sid would follow in his father's footsteps, being elected to the seat of Christchurch North in the 1935 election as a member of the Reform Party. After his election as national leader in 1940, Holland would strengthen National support base by merging smaller Conservative Party into the Nats. 1943 saw the climax of the Second World War with Kiwi service personnel fighting in many theatres across the globe. Fears of a Japanese invasion of New Zealand soon dissipated when in late 1942 between 15,000 and 45,000 American service personnel, mostly Marines, were stationed in New Zealand as they prepared to push the Japanese out of the Pacific. By mid-1943, tensions were low enough that Fraser could call an election for September of that year. Issues surrounding the war naturally came to dominate political debate. Shortages appeared, particularly on the home front, prompting a certain amount of dissatisfaction with the government. Campaigning for this election wasn't just limited to New Zealand's shores. Special legislation allowed Kiwi servicemen overseas to vote, and the Prime Minister made several goodwill visits to troops prior to election day. And the winner was? Well, at first it wasn't clear. With so many overseas votes, it wouldn't be until a month later where the country would know which way it voted. Those voters still in New Zealand, a majority of whom were farmers and housewives, saw a huge swing to National, and for almost a month, National led in a majority of seats by only the thinnest of margin. When the servicemen votes came in, however, it saw a huge dump of votes in favour for Labour. So in the end, the final figures were Labour with 45 seats, a loss of 8 since the last election, and 48% of the vote, a loss of 8%. National would gain 9 seats to hold 34 and would win 43% of the vote, a gain of 3%. Only one independent was elected. Labour would retain office by a 10-seat margin, however the popular vote margin was too close for comfort. Sid Holland would channel his inner Donald Trump and cry to stop the steal as he argued there were irregularities with the servicemen ballots. However, he soon let the issue go. 3 bits of interesting trivia for this election. While Labour candidates did well across the country, the Prime Minister would have a close call in his own traditionally safe seat. Radio presenter Colin Scrimgeour, a close friend of Mickey Savage, but an adversary of Fraser, whom he often criticised, would run as an independent to Labour's left. Uncle Scrim was made the Controller General of the government-run National Commercial Broadcasting Service in 1935, but he was removed from that position by Fraser in 1943. Scrimgeour did so well that Fraser's 4,000 vote majority in 1938 was cut down to just 1,000 votes. John A. Lee's Democratic Labour Party would win only 4% of the vote nationwide and no seats. Lee would lose his own seat of Greyland to John Hackett of the Labour Party. The election was also notable for the defeat of Sir Aparangangata, a renowned Māori statesman and member for the National Party for Eastern Māori, after 38 years in Parliament by a Ratana Labour candidate. Labour now held all 4 Māori seats and would continue to do so until 1993. 1940 marked the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. During this time, there would be events as well as films made to mark the occasion. Thanks for watching and come back next time.